Welcome, everybody. We're so thrilled that you've joined us again. This week, we're going to talk about one of the most common things we see here at Amen Clinics that completely shocked me as a psychiatrist. We're going to talk about head trauma and all the different ways it manifests itself to mess with your mind.
Well, and one of the surprising things to me, which we'll talk about, was a shock to me because I'm a neurosurgical ICU nurse, so I dealt with TBIs all the time. So my idea of what a traumatic brain injury means was very different than what it means to you and what it means to our patients. So I want to talk about that as we go.
Right. I mean, you saw people that
with their skull flaps. We would take a flap, piece of skull out.
Have a projectile go through.
Right.
There.
We'd have brain drains, and I mean that's the stuff I saw. So I thought that's what TBI meant.
And that kind of TBI is so visible.
Right.
That
we know.
It's easy to see the consequences.
Right.
Where, super sad story this week, Kelly Caitlin, who was a silver medalist in the 2016 Olympics in cycling, killed herself. And a couple of months before had suffered a concussion along with a broken arm, and her family said she was just not
Never
the same. And so people don't think of concussions really as causing lasting brain damage. But let me just tell you a story. I learned this very early from the imaging work I do. And when I would see damage, especially to the left front side of the brain, that people would get dark thoughts, often suicidal thoughts. And I wrote a column in the local newspaper where I lived in Northern California, in the Daily Republic, on the connection between head trauma and suicide. And I was at my office late one night, and I got a call from a mother who was crying. And I actually stayed to see her that night. And she told me about her son, who was 16 years old, who had a bicycle accident the year before. Straight A student, good boy. And then after the bicycle accident, and they said he had a mild traumatic brain injury. His front tire hit the curb and he flipped over onto his head. And he was unconscious, but only for a few minutes. And she said after that, everything changed. He was mean, he was irritable, he didn't do well in school, and a couple of months before he shot and killed himself. And she said, do you think that head injury had anything to do with it? Probably everything to do with it, because when you hurt your brain, you hurt your life.
Well, and depending on what part, right?
And
so can it really affect what kind of behaviors emerge? Is what I've learned
Kelly
from you.
Was one of the highest performers, right?
And she's going to Stanford.
Medalist,
right.
Who's going to Stanford.
Her whole life in front of her.
Is a triplet, so connected to her siblings. And I have another friend, actually, who, when I filmed the show for CNN, Behind the Mind, I scanned the anchor, and she had a beautiful brain and was highly successful. But her sister, and they're twins, was not nearly as successful because her sister fell from a bunk bed from the top and had a significant traumatic brain injury. And very few people ask, well, this person's really successful and this person isn't. Well, it's because they don't care or they're not motivated. And I just want to tell you, it's way more complicated than that.
But let's talk for a second, because like I said, a lot of people have this idea that it has to be really bad. You have to lose consciousness. You have to be in the hospital. And when you go to the hospital, they'll often say, oh, go home, you're going to be fine. Even if you had a concussion. That happened to my mom recently. She had a really bad fall, which now, 2.5 years later is still affecting her life. She had a brain bleed. And they told her she was fine, and they sent her home. It was crazy. So this happens all the time. Let's talk about the difference, though. What about for people who never go to the hospital, who never lose consciousness, who never realize or
You
believe,
mean like Tana Amen?
yeah, that they had a brain injury. Because that never crossed my mind. And I think so many people who are hearing this are going to go, wait, I didn't know that qualified.
Well, and one of the biggest lessons I learned early on about traumatic brain injury is people forget that they've had serious
because they don't
ones.
think of it as a traumatic brain
And
injury.
so I saw a new patient yesterday, and you could see the damage in his frontal lobes and in his temporal lobes. And I'm like, so when did you have a head injury? Oh, I didn't.
Mm-hmm. See?
And sort of like when you and I had first had that discussion,
Yeah.
and I went, are you sure? Did you ever fall out of a tree, off a fence, dive into a shallow pool? And
Car accidents.
He told me from 13 to 19, he was basically abused by his older brother,
my gosh.
who would take his head and smash it into the linoleum floor.
And so you could see the damage on the scan.
I can see the
But
damage
he's
on the
not
scan.
recalling it because he's not thinking of that necessarily as a brain injury.
Right.
He's thinking of it as his brother beating him up and how many kids get beat up.
Correct. So whether you were beaten by a baseball, whether you're in a car accident, whether you played, had concussions playing sports. I remember when we did the Logan Paul video. And if you haven't seen it,
It's very
you
funny.
can Google it. It's about 14 minutes long, but it's worth watching. He comes
Especially
in
if you've got kids. It's helpful.
And he's so insightful because
And you wouldn't think of that if you've seen his other videos.
No, you wouldn't.
But he actually was.
But he comes in and he says, I want to know why I'm an asshole. And I'm like,
You're not supposed to say that out loud.
I so wish so many of my difficult patients would have that kind of insight. He said, I want to know why I struggle with empathy and relationships.
Connection, right.
And he played football for 4 years and he was really good. So even if he had a concussion, the coach would want him to continue playing. And he fractured his skull
Dude, that's
in
a big
7th
one.
grade in a trampoline accident. So as you stay with us, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the symptoms. And many people have traumatic brain injuries. Well, they sort of get better over time, but they can leave a lasting mark on you. And then we're going to talk about, well, what do you do about it? And so many people go, oh, well, don't do anything for a couple of months.
Right. Wait until it heals.
Remember in our grief
And
podcast, we talk about when do you start healing from grief is as soon as you can. When do you start healing from traumatic brain injury? As soon as you can.
And you look at how critical it is because, I mean, this poor girl who had her entire life in front of her killed herself within a couple months.
And if we would have seen her, if we would
give her
have
hope.
scanned her, we could show the problem, and then we would have started to put her brain in a healing environment. But many high achievers, she's a very high achiever, and she actually, if we did a neuropsych test on her, she may have scored in the normal range, but she wasn't normal for her.
Right.
So it may have taken her IQ from 130 to 115, and she may have absolutely hated that.
Right. She might have been
because
slower.
she knew she wasn't as good as she was. And if you're a perfectionist, that can really drive the darkness in your head. Now you have a review. Thank you for listening to our podcast. We are grateful.
Yes, we love the reviews. So this video gives so much food for thought. No pun intended. Thanks a lot for your help. We definitely need to reconnect with our body, our brain, and with one another. And he's referring to the video with Dr. Perlmutter, which was amazing. We love having him as a guest. And I cannot figure out how to pronounce his name.
Romesh Kanadi.
Kanadi. Okay, so thank you so much for that.
All right, stay with us. More on traumatic brain injury shortly.
If you're enjoying the Brain Warriors Way podcast, please don't forget to subscribe so you'll always know when there's a new episode. And while you're at it, feel free to give us a review or 5-star rating, as that helps others find the podcast.
If you're interested in coming to Amen Clinics, use the code PODCAST10 to get a 10% discount on a full evaluation at amenclinics.com. For more information, give us a call at 855-978-2787.
1363.